Everyone, in this class we are going to discuss about Mule event and understand its structure. What are the different components of a Mule event, and also as it travels along a Mule flow, how does the Mule event and its components change? We are going to discuss and see and so on. We will also discuss about query parameters and DRI parameters. We'll understand what they are, what do we use them for, and why do we need them. So we will run our Mule applications in debug mode and understand the different components of Mule event and see how they change, the different components of Mule event, how they change as we move from one Mule component to the next. So in our previous class, we said a Mule application receives events, processes them, and routes them to other endpoints. And we said it has three components: a source, a processor, and an error handler. And we also said there could be flows without a source, an event source. So an event source is optional, but for a Mule flow to compile, it needs at least a processor. So source and error handler are optional, we said. So once a Mule event source triggers the flow, a Mule event gets created, then that Mule event goes to the next processor. So this next processor, it could be getting data from somewhere, from a database, for example. So the Mule event changes. Now we have payload, and if, for example, if it is reading data, CSV data from our laptop, for example, we also will have attributes in the Mule event about the file, for example, the file name, its size, when it was created, when it was modified. Such kind of things are attributes, whereas the actual data is the payload. So now we have that Mule event, and next maybe that Mule event it gets transferred to the next processor, and the next processor it may get data from somewhere in the cloud, because we are integrating data and devices and applications with Mule. So one of the applications of Mule is integrating data from different sources. So now we have other attributes and other payload coming in. So the Mule event could change, or in this Mule processor, maybe we could be aggregating the data or filtering it or enriching it. It depends. We can do different things with it, but you can understand it at a high level. Now the Mule event is changing. So the Mule event and its contents are changing, and finally that Mule event gets transferred to an endpoint connector. So this is what we are going to understand in this class: the structure of the Mule event, and as it goes from one processor to the other, how does it change? And in previous class, we have seen there are different Mule event source initiators, such as listener, scheduler, and so on. We will see all of them one by one with real-world applications. But for now, the examples we are looking at are mainly with listener and scheduler. So let's understand the structure of a Mule4 event. So this is Mule4, not like since there was Mule3, the Mule3 structure is different than Mule4. So if you read some articles with Mule3, remember they could be the structure with Mule3 was slightly different as compared to the Mule4 event structure. So Mule4 event structure, one component it has is message. So the message is the data that passes through flows in the app. And the message itself, it has a payload. This is the core information or the core data. This is the data that the app processes. And this payload, it has attributes. Information about the payload is called attributes. So attributes is metadata or data about the data. It is contained in the message header. So what metadata means is if you have some architectural design, for example, of a building, so you have the design in one folder, and you may have an additional file in that folder containing some information about the design. For example, the version of the design, when it was created, who created it, the software used, and so on, such kinds of additional information. The additional information is what attribute means. So it is data about data. And the other component of a mule for event is variable. So variables are metadata at the mule event level. Variables can be defined and referenced in the app processing the event. So we will see, like, when you for example, if you are getting data from one database and in the next processor getting another data from another database, then the payload, it could be overwritten, but one solution is to save the previous payload in a variable. So if you save your previous payload or attributes and so on in variables, then the variables, you can call them, you can reference them down the line in your flow. And another component of a mule for event is exception message or error handler. So this is the structure of a mule for event. Now let's talk about query parameters and DRI parameters. What are they? How do we use them? So consider this one, for example, if we have an API called weather, we have with its URL, then a query parameter, query parameters. I have two query parameters here that you see. In this case, for example, I'm getting data, I'm requesting data for a city in Maryland, and the city ID is 10. So I can have city ID of 10 for different cities in multiple states. And that's why I'm specifying states equals to Maryland. So this one, it is going to give me the weather data, particularly for a city in Maryland. And the city ID equals to 10 and the state equals to Maryland. These are called query parameters. In this case, we have two query parameters, city ID and state. And we concatenate them using ampersand. This means end. Query parameters are attached at the end of the URL, as you can see, and they are preceded with a question mark. So we can have multiple query parameters. It depends on the API. Some APIs, query parameter could be optional. Some parameters, it could be required. We have to first read the documentation of the API, know how it works and what it expects. But as you can see, query parameters, they help us to interact with the API and specify what we want. For example, this could be filtering the data based on our specification, or it could be also specifying the format of the data that we want the response to be. Like in here, I may add and format equals to JSON. In that case, it is going to return the data in JSON format. Next, let's talk about RI parameter. So here I have the weather API. I have added city ID with curly braces. So this one, we specify it in the path when we build the API in Anypoint Studio, and this is called URI parameter. So it is a required field. It filters data particularly. It gives data particularly for that city, for the city ID 10. So this kind of request, it returns the data for the specified URI parameter, and it is a mandatory field. It is a required field. If, for example, if I have an API that returns books and it needs a book ID URI parameter, for example, it is going to return data for the specified book ID. So in this case, for example, the city ID 10, how I'm going to pass it is when I send a request, I just the curly braces city ID, I replace it by the value of the city ID. So 10 in this case. So yeah, one of the questions you usually see in MuleSoft developer certification is about the RI parameter and query parameters. And remember, the RI parameters, they have curly braces, not hash sign, square bracket, or not dollar sign. They have curly braces. And when we request the API by specifying the URI parameter also, we just input the value of the URI parameter. We don't say like city ID equals to 10, but simply the city ID in this case, we replace it by 10. We'll see an example when we start building a Mule application next.
So, like now let's understand the difference of query parameters and URI parameters in detail. So, see this one. I have a listener, for example, and okay. So in the past, if you see, I have weather. I hope you can see it. I have weather forward slash curly braces CTID. So this is the path of our application. So CTID is mandatory. It is the RI parameter. As you can see, it is in here in any point studio. We specify it using curly braces. If you see in any point in Postman how I specify it, I just put a number for CTID. I don't put the string CTID itself. I pass the value of the CTID. So my path will be weather forward slash 10, for example. This is for CTID 10. However, the one that starts after question mark, state equals to MD, which is Maryland, is a query parameter. When I put this one, for example, as you can see here also, Postman can detect it that it is a query parameter, and it has specified it here. If I just delete this, you see this value from the query params. They are called query params and DRI params. It means the same thing, query parameters and DRI parameters. So now we don't have a query param, but if I just, when I start with question mark, there is query params it shows. So I can say state is MD, and it has put it here. As you can see, query param key value. So the key is state and the value is Maryland. So this is the difference between query parameters and URI parameters. And the query parameters, they help us to pass our request dynamically. We can have different requests based on our query parameter. And the URI, however, the URI parameter is mandatory. Okay. So the other thing that I want to show here is, okay, in this simple example, what are we doing? So in this simple example, what I'm doing is we are creating, once I send a request from Postman, I want to get the CTID and state. I want to see how I can grab them. Like, okay, so you send CTID and state ID, CTID and state, and based on that you want to filter your data. So first you have to be able to know what the CTID and state value are, and this is how you get them. If it is a URI parameter, we just do, both of them are under attributes. They are attributes. As we said, attributes are mirror data about the payload. So both of them are attributes. If it is URI parameter, we access it using attributes.uri params dot the URI name. So in this case, the URI param is CTID. So I do URI params.cdid. When I do this one, for example, the value of this one will be 10 in our case. However, the query params, we grab them using attributes.queryparams.state. So you see it is dynamic. Like the state value, if I pass Virginia, then the value for this one will be Virginia. If I pass Maryland, it will be Maryland. Then once I get the city ID and the state value that were passed from Postman, based on that I can do the data filtering and send back the request. That is the intention of having the query parameters. And in the PowerPoint slide in here, so on the way also, those of you who have Endpoint Studio installed, you can try them. So I have specified the steps in here. And the other thing, another important information here for today is other thing is we can on any processor we can right click on it and add a breakpoint. So here, if we right click on it, there is, in this case, let me first remove it. Let me first remove from this also, remove breakpoint. So breakpoint means it helps, breakpoints help us to stop there so that we can see what is happening before that breakpoint. And once we are okay, once we understand what's happening before that breakpoint, we can just click next to see, to track the Mule event, to understand what's happening with the Mule event. So here, for example, I right click here, see, and I add a breakpoint. I can also right click here and add breakpoint. Now save this, save all. I have save all here, save them. Now I right click here, and rather than running my project, I debug my project. So this means run it in debug mode so that I can see, I can track the Mule event structure. So let's do that. I right clicked in the on the canvas here and debug project, my params. I have specified the steps on the sliders. You can also test that. So until this gets deployed, let's go over the sliders. So what we said is, probably if the sliders are easier to see here, what we said is always to capture or to get to save as variable or as a payload, to save what was sent as a URI parameter. We use this one. URI parameters and query parameters are attributes first. So if they are attributes, then we access them using attributes dot URI parameters dot CTID. For example, this one, it gives us the CTID value, and attributes dot query parameters dot state gives us the state value. So to access, if when we have a hierarchy of data, we just access it using data, using dot. Like for example, let's say I want to access my location. Let's start from world. So world dot, okay, or earth dot, then country, with the country will be USA. So earth dot USA. Then let's go to state, earth dot USA dot Maryland dot, next let's put city, Columbia dot, then you can continue like that. So when you have a hierarchy of data structure, we go to the level of detail we want using dot. That is why that is what we are doing here. URI parameters and query parameters are attributes, and to get each one of them, we start with attributes dot URI parameters, then the URI param name, attributes dot query parameters, and the query param name also. I hope this one has deployed, and when you see it in action, you will understand it. Okay, so this one has deployed already. Now I can send a request from Postman. So send this one. One thing is, when you experiment with Postman, this may expire if you are experimenting in debug mode, since you will take time trying to understand what's happening. So you can increase the timeout length here. You go to File on the top right, then Settings, then request timeout in milliseconds. Mine, for example, it is 9 with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 zeros. It was 4 zeros, so I added 1 0. Now it takes I think more time, and it doesn't expire. So if you don't want it to time out, if you are facing timeout error issues, just go to File, Settings, and increase the request timeout in milliseconds. You can make it 10 minutes, for example. Okay, so now let's send this request. And pay attention here. Now when we send the request, you will see our request in Anypoint Studio, and we will see the Mule event, what it has inside it. So send, as you can see, the request has been sent and it is waiting. So since it is waiting, you see it doesn't display any data here. If we come here, you see the request that has been sent. So you see here, this one was empty before, this upper rectangle. Now you see it has attributes, payload, variables. These are the main things that we are going to focus for today. And we said a Mule event in this slide, a Mule event has message, variables, and error exception. We focus on the message and variables, and under message we have payload and attributes. So let's see what are the payload, the attributes, and the variables we have, and how do they change. So you see payload, there isn't any payload yet because we didn't get any data. Either we didn't read data or payload was not sent in our request. So in the request we sent, had it been like writing data to a database, and if it included data, actual data, the actual data would be in payload. Now payload is empty. If we are using the read CSV, for example, the read CSV that you did in recent project, in the recent class, then the data from the CSV will be the payload. But now it is empty. We will see. We will just create a payload, a dummy payload, and see how it changes. But if you expand attributes, just expand attributes here. See, if we expand attributes, we see different information here. Query params is here. So click on query params, expand query params. It shows me the size of query params is 1 because we can have more than one. And you see the key is state and the value is Maryland. So we have key value. We have one query param and we can see what it is. The key is state and the value is Maryland. So now in this stage, before getting to the transform message, now I know what my Mule event looks like. It has a query param. It has also a URI param. You see URI params, if you go down here, if there is no URI params, the size will be 0. But now it says size 1 because we have URI params. And I can expand this here and you see the key is CTID and the value is 10. And when you get here in this stage, when you see this Mule event, if you want to like access the query params and URI params or other things from here, what they look like, you can just click this evaluate data with expression. On the top right we have the x plus y equals to question mark. So if I click this one, it brings up this one. So this one helps us to understand the Mule event in debug mode. I just can write some code here and see if what output it gives me. Like for example in here, if I do attributes dot URI params dot what was the URI param value? The key. I need the key. So the key is CTID. You do this for example in the next processors. You have some business logic that you want to implement, but you are not sure about the structure, what it looks like. So you experiment this on the way. By experimenting what the output looks like, then if I know to access, if I am not sure, for example, to access the CTID value, I experiment like this here using this evaluate data with window. Then once I make sure I understand it is like this, that it works, then I can implement this in the next flow. So now if I click evaluate, you see it gives 10. 10 is our value for the CTID. Or if I want to access what was passed for the state value, you see state is MD. Then if I come here, you see this evaluate data with expression. By the way, it is ephemeral window. Once you click elsewhere, it disappears. So come here again and I can type attributes dot query params dot state. So this one, it should give me Maryland, for example. You see the value is here. This is what we pass it. So why are we doing like that? You may ask. And for those of you who didn't have any kind of programming background, it may look kind of overwhelming, but it is just easy. Just remember query params and attributes. Query params and URI params are attributes. You get them under attributes here. That is why we had to click attributes here and expand it. So both of them are attributes, and then to get their values, we start with attributes dot. So at a high level it is attributes. Under attributes, we have query params. So attributes.query params. I have reached at query params now. Then to get specific value for a query param, I add dot key, the key value. Like in this case, we just have state. So the state value, the state value is Maryland. And to get this state value, we do attributes.query params.key. And the same way, URI params we have here, to get this value of 10, I have to start with attributes, because they are, both of them are attributes for sure. I know I have to start with attributes dot, and next it is URI param, not query param. So I go to URI params, attributes dot URI params dot, then the key is city ID, then it gives me 10. So until this stage, we have understood the contents of attributes, basically the URI params and query params. And attributes are metadata about our payload. Like for example, if I am to get data for this state and you see this state and city ID, then the state and city ID, the query params and attributes, the query params and city ID tell me what the data is for. It tells me to which city ID and to which state it belongs. So attributes are, for this reason, metadata about our main data. Data about data, basically. Some information about the main data is what attribute means. So next, from the transform, in this transform message, what am I doing? It is just I want to show you how we can capture them. So I'm just creating an object. This one we said, when we have curly braces here, this is an object. If we put it in square brackets, it is an array. So the city ID attributes.ri params.cityid, the state attributes.query params.state, and this output, I want it to be in JSON format. You see the application, the output here is application /JSON, because we can make it XML, Java, CSV, and so on. So I'm making it JSON. And also this output, I'm saving it to payload. I want it to be payload. You can make it to be variable as well, but I want it to be the main payload. So what does it mean? When when this transform message is executed, our payload will not be empty. We will have values for payload. You see, now the payload is empty. We don't have, I think, disregard this one that is showing on the right. I think this is something saved from before. But here, you see our payload. If I expand it, I don't see any data. There is no any data here. So there is no any data here that you can see. It is empty now. It is gone. So for payload, we don't have data. We see we have attributes. The attributes we have are URI params and query params, but we don't have payload. And we have created a payload here using the transform message transformer or processor. We have created a payload. The payload is the main data, basically the concept. It can be data that you read from CSV, the data that you can get from some database, and so on and so on. But we can also just create ourselves some dummy values here that I am creating to just capture the city ID and states that were passed in the request. And I'm saving it as payload, as you can see. Notice here it is payload, not variable, but you can save it to a variable as well. We will see that next time. So the other thing here is also we don't have variable. You see vars, we don't have vars here. Vars are variables. So when we have variables, the variables value, we are going to access them. We can access them from vars using vars dot, like we did at a high level for the query params and the URI params. We started with attributes, and for variables we start with vars. For the payload, we start from payload. So in this slide, to access the attribute values, query params and the URI params, we do attributes dot URI params dot the URI param key, and query params attributes dot query params dot query param key. And for variables, we access them using vars dot the variable name. And for payload also, we are going to see how we can access them. So now, as you can see, this transform message has not yet been executed. It has stopped there. What does it mean? It means it has executed the Mule components before where it has stopped. So the transform, it has stopped in this transform message. That means only it has listened in this case. That means it has only triggered. That is why we have only these attributes, but we don't have payload. Now I can click next processor using this one. On the top right, we have next processor button. You can also use F6. Now if I click this, it will move from transform message to the logger. Okay, let me click that. Okay, as you can see now, it has moved from the transform message to the logger. So that means this one has been executed, and we see payload now. We see values for payload. If I click payload, before it was empty, now we have these values for payload. See here on the top, on the kind of top right, I have values for payload that was empty before. And what are the values for the payload? It is just what we have specified here, the city ID and the state. Why are we doing like that? Because we want to capture the values of the URI parameters and the query parameters, and once we know their values, then we can filter and aggregate our data based on that condition. Like for example, someone, if they say in their query parameters, if they specify format equals to JSON, that means they want, let's say they want the data in JSON, then we have to transform the data to JSON using some conditionals. Or if they say month is equals to July, then we have to give them data for July only. So we have to know what query params and URI params they passed. So now, as you can see, we started with attributes. We said we understood the structure of attributes. We have in our case query parameters and URI parameters. We saw how we can access them. Our payload was in the beginning empty, but now we added payload here. So you see the value of the payload has changed. Next is the logger here. Logger, as we said, is simply it prints some useful output to the console. That's it for us to understand what is happening. In this case, for example, I have added this one. So for the message value, we have you sent. So we said if you start with # square bracket, that means it is an expression. It is data with expression. It is code. So you sent is just a string. It is going to take it as is. But in here, I have city for the city ID. Okay. This one rather than vars, it is because I was creating variables. It says vars.cityid. For now, let's do like this: attributes dot I think the city ID is URI params dot city ID, whereas for state attributes dot query params dot state. So this one, it is going to tell me just in the console, it is going to print what the values of the city ID and state are. And we have to be very careful with typo. If we have some typos, it will not work. So attributes.ri params.cityid attributes.query params.state. Okay, so I have to save these changes, but let's see if what it prints. Okay, so this one has not yet expired, right? Perfect. Yes, it is waiting. Okay, so now I click next processor. That means it has finished the whole flow. So you see, when you have a complex, very long flow, you can track, you can understand what is happening in each component by doing like that, by running it in debug mode, adding breakpointers in the important components that you want it to stop. You add breakpointers, then run it in debug mode, then you can see what is happening in each stage. So now if I click next processor, that means it is going to finish it. Okay, what did it print here in, let's see, what did it print in the console first? This one, I think it didn't take the new changes that I made. That's why it is saying ctid didn't get it, because vars dot ctid, the variable, it didn't get it. If I rerun it again, it will get it. That's why it isn't printing nulls. If we come here, oh, this one, it timed out. I took more than the maximum timeout value I have here. Let me add another 0 here. Okay, so I can stop. To stop your application, you click this red rectangle, terminate it. So now I will stop it and rerun it. In the meantime, I will take some questions until it gets deployed. I think that is a good use of our time. Anyone who has questions about the debugger or URI params and the query params, until this gets deployed, we can talk. In the chat, do I see questions?
Hi, Dr. Fisher. I have a question.
Sure.
So can we pass, like when we use the URI params, so can we pass a nested one? Like let's say
Yeah.
within Maryland state, if I have two states, like
Yes.
state ID 10.
Yeah, that's a good question. Yes, that's right. So the URI parameters or the query parameters, they can be multiple. So in here, city ID forward slash block ID, for example, for if it is for some block, for example. You mean this, right?
Yes.
Yes. So in this case, when you send the request, it will be some your URL until whether forward slash the city ID if it is 5, for example, forward slash your block ID if it is 200. Then it gives you data for block ID 200. So yes, you can.
Thank you.
Another question?
Sorry, I have a question about the postman.
Pardon me? Oh, postman. Okay, yeah. Can you get closer to the device? Your sound is low.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Can you just repeat this one a little bit? I think it's when you notice the postman, you gotta go to a work spot. Then
Can others hear him? I have difficulty hearing you. Yeah, probably we can talk later or even just one-on-one. Another one who has questions?
Yeah, I do. Okay. So attributes are metadata and variables are as well. So what is the difference and when do we use the different ones if they both metadata?
Yeah, that's good. That's good. Thank you very much. So see the structure here. If you see the blue regions, we have one upper bigger one, which is called message, and another one variables. So the message itself, it has payload and attributes. The attributes are information about the payload, whereas the variables are high level attributes of the event level. And usually the variables, we create variables in our flow, we define them in our flow, and they are reusable. For example, in our case, when we send let me go to postman. When I pass the city ID and state, these are the attributes. This will be attributes of the message. Then from these attributes, I can create variables. Then these variables, I can use them when I request data from a database in the next processor. So they are we define them. We can define them in our flow variables, and they are reusable. So basically, we put data, because when you the Mule event, as it flows from one processor to the other, like for example, your payload may get overwritten if you have two read CSV operators. Then the first one reads the CSV data, it creates a payload. Then the next one also reads another data, it creates a payload. What it is going to do is it may overwrite, if it is not handled appropriately, it may overwrite the payload from the first read CSV. So what we can do is, for example, the data from the first read CSV, we save it in a variable. So that variable down the line, we can call its value and use it in our processor. Maybe when we see more examples, we'll understand it. But yeah, thank you for noticing that difference. Both of them are metadata. Attributes and variables are metadata. They are data about data. So the attributes are metadata about the message, whereas variables are metadata about the Mule event. So, and they are reusable. We can define them and reference them in the app. Now this one, it has completed. Let's send now again from Postman. Sending this request. It should not expire now.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, we'll talk later. Let's first finish this, then we can talk later.
I just have the same question. I just want to know which one you want to use, XML or JSON when you like send the link.
Pardon me. You are still far. I mean, I could not clearly hear you.
When you do you use this XML or JSON when you like use your Postman's what you doing right now?
Oh, it depends on what we specified. We will see more examples. It depends on what is specified. In this output, I'm just returning the output in JSON, but you can specify whatever format you want. Okay, so here in the attributes, I think this one we explained it before. If under attributes, we should have the URI parameters, which is a CD ID. The key is CD ID, and the value is 10. And we have the query parameters. Query parameters also key value parentheses them. Key is state and value is Maryland. And in this stage, since we have not yet this transform message processor has not been executed yet, so our payload is empty. But when I click next, now we see value for the payload. And in this transform message, my output, I'm specifying it to be JSON. So in Postman, it should come in JSON format, because this is the, my last processor. So this is the payload. The payload in the last processor is what gets returned to Postman. So in this case, this will be just JSON data. We can change it to CSV and see what it looks like when we make it CSV also. You can play with that. So now we have the payload value we said, and I can click next processor, then it exits from the flow, and we can see what it returns to Postman. If you come to Postman here, you see, so this is in JSON format. You can see the output, what it looks like. City ID 10, state Maryland. You may ask, this may sound childish, what are we doing? We have specified those things here. Why are we getting them back here? We are just trying to understand how we can access the values of the URI parameters and query parameters. What are URI parameters and query parameters? 2, how do we access their values? 3, how do we debug our Mule event as it flows from one Mule component to the other? How do we debug a Mule event and understand its contents? That's what we are doing. We can, and also here in the console, if I come here, I have fixed this, so now it should work. As you can see in the console, I hope you can see this one. It says in the right, it says you sent city ID equals to 10, state equals to Maryland. So if I can capture this, if I can grab what was sent as query parameters and URI parameters, then I can aggregate my data or filter my data based on that. Okay, this is how we debug a Mule event, understand its structure, how it changes as it flows from one processor to the other, and also we also saw what query params and the URI params are. Now let's modify this. Let's add variables to it. So in our debugger, you see initially the payload was empty. We had values for query params and attributes, but the variables was empty. Now let's create variables. somewhere here and see how the values for variables changes. So I can stop this, and so you can return to the, we have three perspectives here. The Mule debug perspective is here. You see, out of these three kind of icons, we have, if you hover over them, Mule debug and the design and the API perspective, we click this design perspective to get back to the full screen like this. So I stopped it. Now we can add variables under core module. There is add variables. So set variable, we can bring here set variable, drag and drop it, set variable. And I can, let's say for example, I can create two variables. This one, let's call it city. This is display value, so the display name, you can put it any descriptive intuitive name. So I will call it city ID. Here the value of the variable, like this is x equals to 5. So to get the value of x, this variable name, it should not be like, it should not have space and so on. There are conventions for variable name, so we just make it one string. So this is city ID and the value. So you see value here, when you see fx, this is very important, guys. See, if you see, when you see fx, it says, if you hover over it, it says switch to expression mode. So the difference is what you put here. If you click this, if you are in expression mode, that will be code. It will be understood as code. If it is in a literal mode, however, it is going to take it as a literal. So here, for example, the difference, let me show you. If I put attributes dot URI params dot ctid, now the difference, if I click this one, this is code. It is going to get the value of the ctid from the attributes.uri params. However, if I do it like this, if it is just in literal mode, the value will be just this whole string. That's it. So when we want to put it as a string, we make it in literal mode. When we want it to be code, then we click this. We switch to expression mode. So now in this case, I have to switch to expression mode so that it becomes code. Okay. So this is our first variable. Oh, city ID. Okay, let me bring it here. Our first variable. Now second variable is here, state, variable name state. Here also I have to switch to expression. You see, when I switch to expression, it brings this pound sign, square bracket. That is a sign that it is making an expression. It is converting an expression. Without clicking this fx also, you can do that like by yourself. If I start with this, then it knows this will be an expression. But rather than putting this yourself, you can simply click this fx. So now it is an expression. I want the state value. So for state, attributes dot query params dot state. So I have created two variables. These variables, why am I creating variables? We want variables like when we are processing, analyzing some mathematical equation, we have intermediate variables, for example, that we want to use in our final output. They are reusable the same way. If we have x equals to 5, y is equals to 10, down the line you can have x plus y, x times y, or some other variables divided by x and so on. So these are the same thing, variables. So these variables I have created. Now in my logger, for example, I can show you. Let's add breakpoints here. Also add breakpoint in my output, in my logger. Rather than making this attributes.ri params.ctid, the variables, we access them. This is also common in the certification exams. We access them using vars. So under vars means variables, vars.ctid, it gives us the ctid variable. We have to make sure the variable is called ctid. So the name here, I have ctid. It is also case sensitive. Okay, so, and this one, the other one is for state. rather than getting it from attributes, we can do vars.state. You may ask, why do we need to create variables from the attributes? Why don't we just directly use the attributes? Because the attributes could get overwritten, but if we create such variables, we are saving it in those variables, and the variables we can reference them. Like once we send a request, if we are, you can test it yourself. Once we send a request to the HTTP listener, in the flow, if there is read CSV, for example, the attributes will be different. They will be overwritten. It could be attributes about the data, like the CSV data, for example. When you read CSV data, the attributes will be information about that CSV data, like its size, maybe when it was modified, when it was created, file name, and so on and so on. So, but if we use variables this way, then we make sure the important information, we are not missing it. We are not losing it, that it is not getting overwritten. So now this one, I can run it in debug mode. And the only difference we will notice from the previous one is now we have variables. Vars was empty before. Now when we get to state, we will have one variable when this gets executed. When it gets the logger, we will have two variables. So save this. Always when you make changes, don't forget to save. Save all is empty, is there. You can have also another save button on the kind of middle right, but save, or that one, the one on the middle right, it saves only what is the recent changes you made, but the save all, it saves every change that has not yet been saved. So save all is nice time saver. Okay, so this one, run it in debug mode again. Run it in debug mode until this deploys. I can take a couple of questions. Who can ask questions? Is this going to be part of the project? Yeah, I have exercise in the slide, in the last slide for this week. I have exercises. You have to practice with the exercise and understand this. This is very key, like entry point, understanding how it is changing, how the Mule event changes, and knowing query params and URI params is very important. So yes, please practice them. I have an exercise. I think if that answers your question, I have an exercise here. Add breakpointers to the read CSV Mule project you created in one of the previous classes. Run it in debug mode. Understand how and why the Mule event changes. What's the payload? What are the attributes? Do they change? Why are they changing? If they are changing, and so on. Yeah, so this exercise, I think it will help you. But going forward also, when you create any flows, try to run it in debug mode as well, so that you can understand it in detail. Who has any questions until this actually it is deployed? Okay, so let's send another request from Postman. I'm sending another request again. So the only difference between this one and the previous one, we said, is the variables. We didn't have variables before. Vars was empty. Now we will have value for vars. And we said, why do we need variables? Because we can reference them in our next processors. They help us not to lose our data. It could be attributes or payload. Okay, send.
Dr. Fish,
Yes.
so are you able to, since earlier, are you able to run it without using the resources now?
Without the
HTTP? So
it,
how do we do that?
it depends. It depends on my flow here is a listener, but you can have a scheduler here. Like,
okay.
did you attend the class yesterday?
No, I watched the video.
Yeah, but yeah, so in that one, for example, we have the scheduler, we have also exercises, and they have included it in the screenshots in the sliders. It is the same thing. The scheduler also, when it gets triggered every 10 seconds, for example, it's going to create a Mule event. And you can add a debugger to that also to understand what is happening.
Okay.
because without the debugger, it is like black box and it is difficult to understand what is happening. And especially when there is an error, it could be overwhelming. But if you know how to debug it and understand how and why it is changing, then it becomes easier to understand. It gives peace of mind. Okay, so now I sent another request. See this one, it is sending request and waiting. Here I come. My attributes are the same like before, so I don't want to go to attributes again. My payload initially is empty. When this transform message gets executed, there will be values. My vars, we are on this stage right now. Vars, you see vars size on the top right. What do you see for vars? Size equals to 0. We don't have variables. We don't have variables yet because it has stopped in here in the transform message. So I click next processor. Okay, now I have payload. It was empty before, but my vars are still empty because this one, it has stopped on the CTID. The CTID set variable has not yet been executed, so that is why we don't have any variables. When I press next processor, how many variables will I have? When I press the next processor just once. Who can answer?
2 variables, I think so.
When I click it just once.
One.
One.
Why one?
One variable.
You will have one variable.
Why one variable?
Because the state is not executed.
Yes, it will stop on state. Yes, because we have that breakpoint. If we don't have, if we don't have breakpoint here, just when we click next processor, it will stop in the logger. It stops before executing where there is a breakpoint. So if I click next processor now, it is going to stop on state. So let's do that. State. So now we have one variable. The variable is the CTID. I can expand it and you see it is the key is CTID and the value is 10. So I can see to access this variable here, you can just experiment this to understand. It will take you some time to understand the structure and that's completely fine. So here vars dot CTID. If I do this one will give me 10 as you can see here. So there is one variable, the size. I see size is 1. I see the key and I see the value. So when you are working with, when you are exploring and looking at data types that you have when you encounter new data types, you use a debugger to understand its structure. Try different things. Some of them will not work. Some of them will work. Then on the way you understand really how it behaves. Okay. So we have one variable. Click next. Now I have two variables, CTID and state. The same way for state, I can just do vars dot state. So this should give me my state variable value. See now this CTID and state, if I create the same variables again, they will be overwritten. But if I create any other variable name, they will not be overwritten. It is like having a variable called x, then create other variables. It doesn't matter. Your x variable will be there. But if you create another, the same other value, if you reassign another value to x will change. So the same way here, the variable values, if you don't create if you don't create variables with the same names again, they will not be overwritten. Whereas payload, it could be overwritten. So your payload, you can save it to variables to use it down the line in your down the line in your flow. Okay. And in our logger, before we were accessing the query params and the RI params, but now we are accessing vars.ctid and vars.state. So you see also the differences. This one is probably for now, it may sound a lot of information, but if you just sit and spend some time on it, you will understand it. And these are, I have just questions very similar to the certification questions in our Kahoot today. So these are things that you should commit to your brain. Okay. So now next processor, it exits. if I get back to Postman, I see the same output. And if I come to the console, also I'm accessing it using vars, but it should tell me the city ID and the state. The same thing. Okay. Another thing quickly we can try is the transform message. We can change this to CSV. You see the difference. So save this, and I can take another question until this gets redeployed. Let me terminate it. Yeah, what other changes can we do here? We change this to CSV. So we'll see the payload difference. When we get here in the variables, the payload value, we will see CSV data rather than an object like this. And also in Postman also we will see CSV output. We can also add, so the first column is called header. We can also add header equals to false, for example, if we don't want header, but header is true by default. And in this case, since we want the header, the city ID and the state, that means let's just leave it as is. So now let me run this in debug mode. And who has any question?
I have question.
Go ahead, please.
Okay. Are these parameters work for all connectors like HTTP, something like that?
It depends. Okay, so different of them, they have different attributes and parameters that we specify. So it depends. But if you are sending an HTTP listener from an external tool, yes, URI params and query params are things that you can specify, and they are not must. It depends on what the application is and how it is structured. Like for example, if the application here, if it doesn't have city ID in the path, here we have city ID. If it doesn't have city ID, if it is until weather, then you cannot pass city ID URI param. Rather, you could pass query params. The query params also, it depends what query params you pass. Also, it depends on how it is created. So every application, every API has a documentation. It has information on what query params it has, and which ones are mandatory and which ones are optional, and so on. So first we read the documentation, we understand what the API is doing, then we pass we send our request based on the documentation. Okay, see if this has deployed. Okay, yeah, it has deployed. Now let's send another request. So what did we do now? Who can tell me what's the difference between what we are doing right now? Why I redeployed it again? What's the what significant changes did we make, and why did we make it?
We changed from JSON to CSV.
Perfect. Yeah, thank you. Yes, so in here the output, rather than an object like this, it will be city ID, and the state will be we'll have two rows. The first row will be city ID, two columns. I mean, the first column will be city ID, the second one will be state. They will be separated by comma, and in the second row we will have their values, rather than an object like that, like this. So send the request. Now come here. Okay, this one we have seen it. This is for our third time. I can just press next. Vars were empty before first. They are still, we don't have variables. Now we will have one variable. See, we have one variable. Click next. Now I have two variables, and I have, oh yeah, the other thing, this payload I can show you here also. See here, before it was an object. Now you see it is CSV, comma, separated values. So the first row is the headers. They are separated by comma, city ID and state, and their corresponding values are on the second row. So you can see it here, the change. Also, you when we finish this flow, also we can see it in Postman. If you come to Postman, also you see in Postman also, rather than JSON format, we have CSV format. So it depends on the application. In some applications, maybe you may need to specify the format here. They may want you to specify format equals to CSV, for example. Or in other applications, there could be a default format. and passing a format is optional. In other applications, maybe it gives back the data only in one format, maybe JSON only, which is common, either JSON or XML. So the values of the URI parameters and query parameters you pass, it depends on the API. Understanding the API is the first thing what we have to do, reading its documentation. Now we are just looking the high level first, the terminologies and how they behave and so on, and then we'll bring them all together and build end-to-end application and try to understand. Also, we will see sample online applications and map which ones are query parameters and which ones are URI parameters and so on. Okay, I think.
Dr. Fasa,
Yes, please.
I have a question.
Sure.
I don't know if it is similar to this session. What is the difference between inbound property and outbound properties? Are they similar to attributes?
Not exactly. They were in Mule 3, not Mule 4. So in Mule 4, we focus on these ones. So you may see which of the following is not a component of Mule 4 event. And if you see inbound or outbound properties, that is the answer. They are not here. In Mule 4, it has a different structure. And just focus, Mule 4 has a message, variables, and the message has payload and attributes. Actually, I have sample questions I will show in the code. So yes, they were components of a Mule3 event, but in 4 they are not there. So yeah, they are not part of this class. But we can see. I can send you, I think, the changes, how they compare in Mule3, the inbound and outbound properties in Mule3, what they correspond to in Mule4. I can send you documentation. Thank you for the question.
Thank you.
Okay, I think now we are done. This one, so it is very important. It will need significant time to, you have to sit and read and understand it, and also practice it. Like it should not be just only reading. Be able to say the word, the terminology smoothly. So practicing it, telling it to people. One of the advantages of having study groups is to have presentations, like the same thing that we did in class. One from the team can repeat it again, and then you will have detailed discussion in your subgroup, so that way you can internalize it very well. So now let's have a fun time with Kahoot. I think we are done. Okay, so this question, it is just the same as what, it is kind of certification type question. So in the certification, the easiest questions are such kind of questions. So you see here, what it is saying is, in the Mule event structure, the question itself is down here. In the Mule event structure, where does variable belong? So if I come here, it is not under message. Message contains payload and attributes only. So variable is under Mule event itself. It is under event. It is found under event structure in the event hierarchy. In the event, under event, you have message, variables, and error handler. Under message, you have payload and attributes. So the answer for that, for this reason, the answer is Mule event. Okay, next question. So this one, how do you specify URI is what it is saying.
If we have customer ID URI, do we do customers slash 1234? For example, if the customer ID is 1234, or do we start with question mark and pass it, or do we say customer ID equals to 1234, or what do we do? Okay, so in the postman itself, when we were passing like the city ID, for example, city ID 10, we were doing weather forward slash 10, the number itself. So when I pass 1234 here, it knows that this corresponds to a CD ID, the customer ID. So I don't need to specify customer ID itself. I just pass the value of the customer ID. So this one is correct for that reason. And if we see in the slides that supports this, if we come here, so you have URI parameters are like this within curly braces, and when we pass a request for this curly brace, we pass its value. So whether forward slash 10 or forward slash 100 and so on. So for that reason, A is the correct answer, or the red color is the correct answer. Next one. So what's the, when we pass for book ID, how do we pass it? So for with URI params, what you have to remember is there is curly braces. No dollar sign, no hash sign, no square bracket. Yes. So the blue color is correct. This one, the hash sign square bracket, we use it when we are specifying expression, when we are passing code. And so this one is the correct way to specify a URI param in the path. Perfect. So these questions are there in the slides. You can also go over the questions in the slides and try to understand it well. Thank you very much for participating. Okay, I really appreciate it. Now let's get back to slides and okay. Leave. Okay, so in the slides, what do we have? Did we cover everything? So the questions are here. Oh yeah, I have this one. I could not include it to the Kahoot because Kahoot has a limit on the number of characters. So we have seen all the questions except this one. Let me make this full screen so that you can see it and see who can answer it. So question number 3. So a web client submits a request to that URL that you see, HTTP localhost 8081, and account type is personal. The query parameter is captured using a set variable transformer to a variable name account type. What is correct data with expression to log account type? So this is the same as what we saw in our demo. We saved the variables for query params and URI params in the attributes for query params and URI params. We saved them as variables, and we accessed the values from the variables and printed them in the logger to the console. So this question is the same thing. If you have this, one thing you see, it starts with question mark. It is in the URL, in the request that we send. So we see this is query param, and the query param, it is saying account type should be personal. Now this account type, it is saying it was saved in the flow. It was saved to a variable called account type. Now the account type we want to print it to the console using the logger. How do we print to the console what account type was passed? The first bullet point, the second one, the third one, or the fourth one?
Fourth one.
Why?
Because it's a variable, we have to state it as vars.
Because it has
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Yeah. If they are variables,
Pass
we
it as a variable.
yeah. Perfect. Perfect. Yes, we start with varus dot the variable name, and the other thing you see here is first we have account type that is a string and colon. The next we have hash sign with square brackets. That means we are concatenating string and expression. So the output of the expression will be concatenated to the account